Hello. This is the basic communication model. A simple but overarching model. It shows a limited number of core factors in communication that each have various aspects and can be described in different ways, using different concepts, theories and taxonomies. The first and obvious feature is that there are a sender who sends a message and a receiver who receives this message. For example, one person says something while the other person just listens and tries to understand the message. This is the most basic communication building block. In reality, this may happen when the boss gives an order to a subordinate and does not wait for any reaction. Also, in a lecture, the professor may be constantly sending. However, often the roles of sender and receiver are turned around. The receiver understands the message and reacts to it. Then the receiver becomes the sender. In much communication, this turn-taking can be observed. Later more about that. Let's start to understand this building block. The sender has something in mind that he or she wants to show or tell the other. The things in mind are coded into a message that can be sent and hopefully understood by the other. Humans have many ways to code their message. The broadest distinction is verbal versus nonverbal, with words or with the body. There are many more ways of understanding how things in mind are coded. For example, within verbally coded messages, a distinction can be made between semantics, prosody, and paralanguage. What I say versus how I say it. Within nonverbal or bodily communication, a distinction can be made between, for example, posture, gestures, and facial expressions. Some parts of the message may be coded conscious and deliberately. Other parts may be coded more automatic, outside awareness. For example, sometimes you may think carefully to find the right words, but your hand movements are probably less designed. Thus, because the receiver cannot read the mind of the sender, he or she has to rely on what can be heard and seen. The receiver has to make sense of it, translate the code into something that might be meant by the sender. So the receiver is trying to figure out what the message is by combining all the incoming information from the receiver's words, the tone of voice, the gestures, the duration of the message, and from facial muscles. This is one possible distinction of nonverbal channels that can provide information in communication. Proxemics refers to how close the sender and the receiver physically are. Gestures refers to the different types of gestures made during the communication, some simultaneously to the rhythm of verbal communication. Voice refers to how things are said, prosody and paralanguage. Facial expressions refer to the facial muscle changes. Appearance refers to how one has designed one's appearance and looks. Posture refers to the state of the physical body, like standing or leaning over. Haptics refers to the touching the other's physical body during communication. And gaze refers to the duration of the eye movements. All these nonverbal channels, together with the verbal channel, provide the message in an integrated way. The sender composes a message on the basis of one or more goals. These goals determine what is said and how it is said. The sender may have the primary goal to persuade the receiver. For example, to support the sender in some task. Words, tone of voice, silences are chosen on the basis of this goal. However, the sender may also have the goal to look like an independent and strong person. This goal further shapes the message based on the first goal. The person assembles a message in which different goals come to their right. The receiver tries to understand the message and the goals. On the one hand, the receiver can infer from the message what the goal is or what the goals are. For example, it may become clear that the sender is asking for help. On the other hand, the message characteristics are understood in the context of the goal. For example, the question, "Are you busy?" only becomes clear in the context of the goal to receive support with the task. In addition, the receiver may have her own goal. This goal may influence how the message is understood. The receiver's goal or goals determine what aspects of the message get more attention. For example, the receiver may have the need and the related goal to be treated with respect, and therefore may have especially attention to respect-related cues in the message. Here, goal 1 is the primary and only goal, and the message therefore is, "Can you help me?" When there is an urgency, a secondary goal may be to meet a certain deadline. Therefore, the message is, "Can you help me fast?" The urgency experienced by the sender is translated into the word fast. However, communicating the urgency might be experienced as a demand or coercion by the receiver, which may put the good relation under pressure. To avoid this negative side effect of asking urgent help, the meaningful word "please" is added. In the meantime, the non-verbal aspects of the message should be congruent with these goals, although sometimes one goal may leak disproportionately in the final message. For example, being in a hurry to meet a deadline may be observable from somebody's gestures or tone of voice. People do not enter a conversation blank. They have expectations about what probably will happen in the conversation, and about what should or should not happen. On the one hand, cultures or subcultures have their own ways of communicating. They have sets of rules for various settings that prescribe the boundaries of what is normal in a certain setting on communication in message coding. For example, how do you talk to your professor? Or how do people formulate their opinion in a group? These prescriptions are mostly met, and therefore people can predict what will happen in the conversation. Besides these general communication expectations, people may have expectations about a specific communication partner they are sending the message to. The receiver also has expectations, and they are not necessarily the same as the sender's expectations. The receiver's expectations are used to understand the message. When the message is according to the receiver far beyond what is normal in the specific setting, the message can get a whole different meaning for the receiver. When the coded message is inappropriate, violating the prescribed rules, the receiver may disapprove the message and even disapprove the sender. Here, the blue lines indicate that many messages are possible, but the red dotted lines show that in certain situations only a part of all the possible messages is appropriate. The bandwidth, the distance between the red lines, differs for situations. When the bandwidth is passed, it is said to be violated. The message all of a sudden gets an additional meaning. Depending on the violation, whether it was better than expected or worse than expected, it may lead to avoidance or approach in the communication. In intercultural communication, the sender and the receiver may have very different ideas about what is appropriate. This may have negative consequences for the communication. But there are strategies to handle possible differences in communication rules or bandwidths. The message is coded to reach one or more goals, using expectations which are also related to the context in which the communication takes place. The context can indicate what goals are probably being said, how the message is coded, and what the adequate expectations are. The psychological context refers to the emotional starting point of the communication. What emotions are at play and what is the topic of conversation? Does it move the communicators? Is it a sensitive topic? The relational context refers to the relation of the communicators. Do they know each other? In what role do they communicate? As mother and daughter? Or as professor and student? The physical context refers to the physical setting of the communication. Does it take place on the street or in a private environment? Is the environment noisy or dark? How are people seated? Do they communicate face to face or online? The historical context refers to whether the communicators communicated before. What happened in earlier encounters, but also what has been said before in the running conversation. The message is coded in the context of that specific moment. This is partly mediated through goals and expectations. The sender has her idea about the context and chooses the coding that is appropriate or effective in that context. The receiver also has an idea about the context and what is appropriate and effective. She tries to decode the message with the context in mind. As you may agree, coding one message is a complex task. The final message is an assembly of different goals, expectations and context features. And it is communicated through different channels, like the nonverbal and the verbal. In the decoding, also all these aspects are taken into account. When the message is decoded, meaning that it is understood, correctly or not, the receiver now has something in mind. The receiver becomes the sender and now codes a message in reaction to the earlier message. Again, taking into account goals, expectations and context. This is the iterative or interactive process. The communicators can react to each other in different ways. And this may completely change the direction of the conversation and even of the relationship itself. One of the major goals or sub-goals that people have in their personal interaction is to manage the desired social distance or proximity to the other. Therefore, in communication, people are sensitive to signals of this. Whether they feel the relation is converging, bringing them closer, or diverging, leading to more social distance. For example, person A may send a message with a relational meaning of an approach on the dimension of liking or intimacy. Such message can lower the social distance. For example, person A may say, "How are you?" However, whether the relation actually becomes closer with this question depends on the reaction of person B. When person B also sends an approach message, as in cell 1, "I'm good, thanks for asking," a close conversation develops in which both persons seem to like each other or become more intimate. However, when person B sends a message with a relational meaning of avoidance, for example, "What do you care?" the conversation is taking another direction. They do not get closer, or they may remain distant. When person A has a message with relational meaning of avoidance, and person B also reacts with avoidance, the social distance may become even larger. Such changes in the relationship during the conversation may be consequences or effects of changing goals. For example, the goal to stay on good terms. It may be that other goals, for example, the goal to persuade the other, are frustrated in the conversation and become more salient and more important. The bottom line: things often change during a conversation. Human communication is a complex, highly automated behavior. In milliseconds, a message is composed that represents something the sender has in mind. And in milliseconds, the receiver makes sense of the message and concludes what the sender had in mind. Tens of muscles work in concert in most messages as sounds are produced and bodily movements are made. The generation of most of these aspects of a message is completely unconscious. The sender can talk rapidly and say smart things without having to think about all the words and gestures. Similarly, the decoding of the message of all its aspects simultaneously, verbal and nonverbal, goes automatic and largely unconscious. Often in a few seconds, the decoder thinks he knows the meaning of the message. The basic communication model tries to capture all the processes involved in communication. Far out most concepts, theories and taxonomies on communication can be understood in this global model. Because it is overarching, it can be used to analyze and understand all kinds of interpersonal settings, such as a conversation between partners, between a boss and subordinate, between doctor and patient, the professor lecturing, the radio or TV broadcasting, communication between people with a different cultural background, communication through social media, and communication with computers or with robots. When you apply this model to what you observe, you see more. Bye.